Do you ever wonder if your parents actually love you? Or if they only love what you can do for them? I used to believe my parents loved me, even if they didn't show it the way they did with my younger brother, Ben. But love isn't supposed to feel transactional. It's not supposed to come with a price tag. I remember the exact moment my illusion shattered. I was at my brother's house, watching his kids run around, when my sister-in-law, Danielle, turned to me with a smirk and said, "Your parents only love you when you pay their bills." I laughed it off. What else could I do? Danielle had a way of saying things just to get a reaction, and I refused to believe it. My parents weren't perfect, but they were still my family. They'd supported me at times, hadn't they? Maybe not emotionally, but still, family was family. Then Thanksgiving came. I was expecting the usual invitation, the same tradition we'd had for years. But instead, my mother called me with a condition. "Sienna, we'd love for you to join us, but Ben has been struggling financially. If you could just take care of his credit card debt, it would mean so much to the family. Not 'we miss you.' Not 'we want you there.' Just pay up, or don't bother showing up." That was the moment I realized I wasn't their daughter. I was their personal ATM. And the second I stopped dispensing cash, they stopped pretending to care. This is a true story, found on our /true off my chest, where people share the harshest realities of family, betrayal, and the painful truths we don't want to admit. What would you do in my position? Would you keep paying for love, or finally walk away? Let me know in the comments. And if you want more real stories like this, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for Reddit True Vault. Because some stories aren't just meant to be told, they're meant to be heard. I grew up in a world where your worth was measured in numbers. Numbers on a balance sheet. Numbers in a stock portfolio. Numbers in the barrels of oil our family's company produced each month. And if you weren't contributing to those numbers, you didn't matter. The Lancaster family wasn't just wealthy, we were built on legacy. My great-grandfather founded one of the largest oil and gas companies in Texas, passing it down through the generations like a crown. By the time my father, William Lancaster, took over, the expectation was clear. The firstborn son would inherit the empire, the name, and the respect. That son was my brother, Ben. From the moment he could walk, he was being groomed for the role of CEO. Business meetings, private tutors, networking events. Every part of his life was designed to mold him into the perfect heir. And my parents doted on him, showered him with praise, made it abundantly clear that he was the future of the Lancaster name. Then there was me. At first, I wasn't treated differently. As a little girl, I got the same hugs, the same birthday parties, the same words of encouragement. But that changed the moment I started showing interest in art. It started small, doodles on the margins of my notebooks, sketches I'd taped to the fridge. But when I started taking it seriously, when I asked for painting classes instead of business seminars, when I preferred galleries over stock reports, that's when everything shifted. I was no longer an investment. I was a disappointment. I remember the first time I realized it. I was 12, and I had just won first place in a statewide art competition. I was beaming, holding my certificate like it was the most valuable thing in the world. I ran home, eager to show my parents. They barely looked at it. "That's nice, sweetheart," my mother had said, flipping through the financial section of the newspaper. My father glanced up just long enough to mutter, "How does that help the family business?" That night, I watched as Ben got a full-blown dinner celebration for acing his economics exam. They toasted him like he had just discovered oil himself. That's when I understood. It didn't matter if I was smart. It didn't matter if I worked hard. It didn't even matter if I was good at something. If it wasn't business, if it wasn't something that contributed to the Lancaster empire, then it was worthless. And so was I. I tried to fit in. I really did. I forced myself to take interest in finance. I sat through my father's long-winded lectures about investments, nodding along even when my mind was screaming for an escape. I pretended to be the daughter they wanted. But passion isn't something you can fake. When I was 16, I painted a massive oil canvas for an art showcase. It was the most personal piece I had ever done, something that took months to perfect. My art teacher encouraged me to submit it, saying it had real potential. I was terrified but excited. I begged my parents to come to the gallery. They didn't. That same night, Ben was being awarded some business scholarship at a banquet. Every single member of my family went to support him. I stood alone in that gallery, watching strangers admire my work, and realized that I could be exceptional at something. And it still wouldn't be enough. After that, I stopped asking them to care. I stopped showing them my art. I stopped inviting them to events. I stopped pretending I would ever be part of their world. But even that wasn't enough. Because in the Lancaster family, it wasn't just about succeeding. It was about succeeding in the right way. And I wasn't just not good enough. I was a problem. At family gatherings, relatives would ask, Sienna, when are you going to get serious? Art isn't a career, darling. Business associates would smile politely and say, so, you're the creative one, huh? Like it was some kind of defect. And my parents? They didn't defend me. They didn't reassure me. They just stayed silent. I wasn't Sienna Lancaster, their daughter. I was Sienna Lancaster, the disappointment. That's the thing about growing up in a family like mine. If you aren't valuable to them, you aren't even real. And the second I realized that, I knew I had two choices. I could spend my life begging for approval that would never come, or I could walk away. I think you already know which one I chose. And when that moment finally arrived, it wasn't just an ending. It was the proof that I had never truly belonged. I always knew this day would come. It was never a question of if, but when. I had spent my entire childhood feeling like an outsider in my own home, a footnote in a family that prided itself on legacy over love. And now, standing in my father's study, with its mahogany shelves lined with business books I never cared to read, I realized this was it. The moment they had been waiting for. The moment I finally failed them beyond repair. It all started when I turned 18. In the Lancaster family, 18 wasn't just a birthday. It was an initiation. It was when you stopped being a child and started becoming an asset. And in a household where business was blood, there was only one acceptable path forward: joining the family empire. For my brother Ben, that meant preparing to take over Lancaster Oil and Gas. He had known since birth that his future was already decided for him. And as the golden child, he embraced it fully, stepping into his role with confidence, knowing our parents would always be there to catch him if he fell. For me, it meant choosing between becoming something I wasn't or becoming nothing at all. I had known for years that I didn't belong in their world. I had spent my life sketching in the margins of my notebooks during finance lectures, dreaming in color while they spoke in numbers. So when the time came, I made my choice. I turned down a business degree. I chose graphic design instead. I might as well have set fire to the family crest. The moment my father found out, I knew there was no fixing this. His face didn't twist in anger, didn't even crease in disappointment. Instead, he just stared, cold, unreadable, like he was calculating the exact amount of money, status, and pride I had just cost him. And then he spoke. If you're not part of this family's future, then you're not part of this family. That was it. A simple declaration, delivered as smoothly as if he were firing an employee, not disowning his own daughter. I felt my mother's presence beside him before I even turned to look. She wasn't crying. She wasn't pleading with him to reconsider. She wasn't even angry. She was indifferent. And that hurt more than anything else. Because deep down, I had foolishly believed that maybe, just maybe, she would care. Instead, she reached into her designer handbag, pulled out a checkbook, and wordlessly began writing. No emotion, no hesitation. She didn't even look at me as she signed her name, tore the check from the book, and held it out with the same effortless grace she used when tipping a waiter. A severance package, not enough to ruin them financially, just enough to ensure that when I inevitably failed, I wouldn't drag their name through the mud. Enough to wash their hands of me. I stood there, staring at that slip of paper, feeling something inside me shatter. I had always known I wasn't important to them, but I never thought I was this replaceable. And Ben, he was there. He saw it all. He had grown up beside me, had shared the same walls, the same blood, the same childhood memories. He was the only person in that house who had ever, even briefly, felt like family to me. But he didn't say a word. He didn't stop them, didn't tell them they were wrong, didn't even look at me. He just stood there, hands in his pockets, staring at the floor like none of this was his problem. And maybe it wasn't. Maybe, in his mind, I had done this to myself. Maybe he truly believed, just like our parents, that this was the price of choosing my own path. That night, I packed my bags. I didn't cry. I didn't beg. I didn't ask for another chance. I had spent 18 years fighting for a place in that family, and I was done. But here's the thing no one tells you about leaving, about really leaving. It's not just walking out the door. It's waking up in a world that no longer recognizes you. It's looking at your phone and realizing that no one is checking in. That the only people who ever reached out to you were the same people who had just cut you off. It's sitting in an empty apartment, staring at a blank canvas, wondering if you made the biggest mistake of your life. And it's opening Reddit at 2 a.m., searching for strangers who might understand you better than the people who raised you. Because that's what I did. I found r/true off my chest in the middle of one of those nights. One of those nights where the silence was too loud, where my mind kept replaying the moment my father said I wasn't his daughter anymore. And for the first time, I read stories that felt like my own. People who had been cast aside for being different. People who had spent their whole lives trying to earn love that was never real to begin with. And in those stories, I found something I never had in my own home: validation. Because it wasn't just me. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't overreacting. I wasn't selfish for choosing myself. I had done the only thing I could do. And if my parents saw that as betrayal, then maybe they were never really parents to begin with. But escaping wasn't the same as being free. Starting over was brutal. There's this romanticized idea that when you break free from a toxic environment, you suddenly step into the light and everything just falls into place. But the truth is, leaving was just the beginning of an entirely different kind of struggle. I had nothing. No safety net. No trust fund. No family support. Just a passion for art and a deep, burning need to prove, to myself more than anyone else, that I could survive without them. The first few years were a blur of exhaustion and failure. I took whatever jobs I could get: waiting tables, selling sketches at flea markets, even designing cheap logos for businesses that wanted to pay me pennies for hours of work. Some months, I could barely afford rent. Other months, I skipped meals just to make sure I had enough for supplies. I poured everything into my art, convinced that if I just worked hard enough, someone would notice. But the world doesn't hand out success just because you want it badly. I sent out portfolios to galleries, only to get rejection after rejection. One curator told me my work was decent for a hobbyist and suggested I consider a more stable career path. Another gallery owner smiled while handing back my portfolio and said, "Abstract sells. People don't want realism anymore." I was exhausted, frustrated, broke, and for a fleeting moment, I wondered if my parents had been right all along. But then something changed. One night, after another shift at a bar where I spent more time dodging drunk customers than actually working, I sat in my tiny apartment, staring at a half-finished canvas. I was so tired that my hands were shaking, but instead of going to bed, I picked up my brush, and I painted, not for a client, not for approval, not even for the hope that it would sell. I just painted because it was the only thing that had ever made me feel alive. That piece, raw, messy, emotionally charged, was the first one that went viral. I had posted my work online before, but something about this one resonated. It was shared, then reshared, then featured in an art blog. And suddenly, I had messages pouring in. People asking if I took commissions, if I sold prints, if they could buy the original. It was an overnight success, but it was the first real crack in the wall that had kept me struggling for years. So I leaned into it. I built an online presence, showing not just my finished pieces, but the chaotic process behind them. I started selling prints, then limited edition canvases. Then a luxury interior designer reached out, someone who worked with high-end clients looking for statement pieces. The kind of people who didn't just buy art, they invested in it. By the time I was 29, I wasn't just surviving. I was thriving. I had a private studio, a team handling logistics, and clients willing to pay six figures for my work. Corporations commissioned murals. Wealthy collectors fought over limited releases. My name, my work, was in demand, and I had done it without a single dollar from my family. For the first time in my life, I didn't owe anyone anything. But freedom has a funny way of drawing back the very people who once cast you aside. It started subtly, in ways that were easy to dismiss at first. A missed call from my mother. A short, hesitant voicemail. The kind that carried just enough weight to make me notice, but not enough to feel genuine. She said she was just checking in because it had been a while. I didn't return the call. I didn't need to, because I already knew what this was. For years, I had been invisible to them. Nothing more than a stain on the family name, an embarrassment they had long since written off. And yet, now that I was someone, now that my name held weight outside of theirs, they had suddenly remembered I existed. At first, I thought maybe I was just being cynical. Maybe, just maybe, they had changed. But then the calls became more frequent, the messages a little less subtle. Between meetings and deadlines, I checked my phone only to see another missed call, another carefully worded voicemail about how family is important and how I was missed. It was almost amusing. The same family that had so easily discarded me now seemed determined to reestablish contact. And then, eventually, the real reason surfaced. My mother's voice, carefully rehearsed, made it clear. She spoke about reconnecting as a family, about how things have been difficult lately, about how the family business wasn't what it used to be. She even made a point to mention that I wouldn't have to worry about that, as if my success was some distant, irrelevant thing. That sentence stuck with me, the way she had said it. Like my achievements were an afterthought, like they were a convenient piece in whatever scheme they were building. For years, my art had been mocked, dismissed as nothing more than a childish hobby, a phase I would outgrow. It wasn't real work. It wasn't a respectable career. And yet, now, suddenly, it had value to them. It didn't take long for my father to reach out. He never wasted time on pleasantries. He never had. He talked about family unity, about standing together, about how I had built something impressive, something he respected. But it was never just about acknowledging what I had accomplished. It was about reminding me where I had come from, about my responsibility to my roots. That word, responsibility, had been a chain around my neck for years, dragging me down with the weight of obligation I had never agreed to carry. And now, they were asking me to come back. Not because they had finally seen my worth, not because they had any real interest in me as a person, but because I had money. Because, after years of shunning me, they needed something from me. I didn't even have to ask what had changed. The family's oil empire, the very thing that had made them gods in their world, was crumbling. The industry was shifting, their investments weren't yielding the returns they once had, and for the first time in their lives, my parents were looking at the possibility of failure. And I was their lifeline. That's when my brother reached out. Benjamin Lancaster, the golden child, the future heir of the family business. The one who had everything handed to him, while I had been cast aside like an afterthought. His message was short, a simple suggestion that we should talk. I stared at it for a long time. Not once in all these years had he contacted me on his own. Not when I was struggling, not when I was building my life from nothing. But now, when his comfortable world was at risk, suddenly, I was worth talking to. Curiosity got the better of me. The conversation was predictable. He was struggling. The company was struggling. His position as the untouchable golden boy was slipping. And with it, the entire foundation of his existence. His words carried frustration, entitlement, a quiet desperation. He wasn't used to not getting what he wanted. He framed it all under the guise of family, of loyalty, of how I had done well for myself, and how family helps each other out. The irony of that statement was almost overwhelming. For years, I had been nothing to them. When I needed help, there was no family to turn to. No father offering me guidance, no mother checking in to see if I was okay, no brother extending a hand when I was struggling. And now, suddenly, I was supposed to believe that family meant something? That the same people who turned their backs on me were now entitled to my success? I sat with that thought for a long time, because this was the moment I had always wondered about. The moment I had imagined in the quiet hours of the night when I had nothing but my own stubbornness keeping me going. What would I do if they ever came back? What would I say if they finally saw me? And now here it was. But the truth was, they still didn't see me. They saw my money, my success, my ability to fix what they had broken. I wasn't a daughter. I wasn't a sister. I was an investment, and I wasn't buying in. Then, just when I thought I had finally broken free, reality came knocking again. It happened the day before Thanksgiving. I was in my studio, finishing up a commission for a client when my phone rang. I almost didn't answer. I had gotten good at ignoring my parents' calls, at letting their numbers flash across my screen before fading into silence. But something in me hesitated. Maybe some small, foolish part of me still wanted to believe they were reaching out for the right reasons. I picked up. My mother's voice was light, almost pleasant, the way someone sounds when they're trying to pretend things are normal. She asked how I'd been, made some passing comment about how she'd seen my latest feature in an art magazine. A subtle acknowledgement, but not a real compliment. Then, without preamble, she got to the real reason she called. Thanksgiving dinner. She told me the family was getting together at the estate, that it would be wonderful if I could join. I almost let myself believe it, almost thought that maybe, just maybe, they had finally accepted me for who I was, that they wanted me there because I was their daughter, because they missed me. Then she kept talking. There was a condition. There was always a condition. She told me Ben had been having a tough time lately, that his credit cards were maxed out, that the business wasn't doing as well as they had hoped. She sighed, as if the weight of it all exhausted her. Then, casually, as if she were asking me to pick up a bottle of wine on the way over, she told me I could come to Thanksgiving if I paid off his debt. I didn't speak. I didn't breathe. It was absurd. A price tag on a family gathering. On my place at the table. For a moment, I thought maybe I had misheard her. But no, she repeated it, this time with a practiced softness in her voice, the kind meant to manipulate, to guilt trip. "You know how hard he works," she said. "And you've done so well for yourself. It would mean so much to us. Us, not me. Not because they wanted to see me. Because they wanted something from me." That was the moment it all clicked. The years of small, subtle realizations came crashing down into one undeniable truth. I wasn't their daughter. I was their investment. A resource. A walking bank account. I let the silence stretch out. Then I told her no. It wasn't a dramatic moment. There was no screaming, no long-winded speech. Just a simple, final no. She didn't react right away. Like she couldn't quite process the idea of me refusing. Then her tone changed, shifting from warmth to irritation, then to barely concealed anger. She called me ungrateful, told me that family helps each other, said that I wouldn't be where I was without them. But that was just it. I was where I was despite them, not because of them. I hung up before she could say anything else. Almost immediately, my phone lit up again with messages from my brother, my father, even a few distant relatives, all parroting the same thing. I was selfish. I was cruel. I was betraying the family. And then, amidst all the noise, one final message. It was from Danielle. Short, simple, cutting straight to the truth. "They only love you when you pay them. Don't forget that." And for the first time, I didn't. But knowing the truth and accepting it were two different things. They didn't take my silence as an answer. They took it as a challenge. At first, it was the texts. A relentless flood of guilt-laced messages from my mother, my father, even Ben, each one dripping with outrage, entitlement, and manufactured heartbreak. "How could you do this to us? After everything we've done for you?" Family is supposed to help each other. The words blurred together after a while, a relentless chant of obligation disguised as love. I left them on read. Then came the calls. Unanswered, ignored, piling up in my voicemail box like a collection of ghosts. My mother's voice tight with barely restrained anger, my father's tone filled with exasperation, and Ben, who had never once defended me, suddenly pretending to care. "We need to talk, Sienna. This is getting out of hand. You're being dramatic." I deleted them all without listening to the end. But they weren't done. They needed a new narrative, one where I wasn't the victim of years of neglect and emotional manipulation, but the villain in their story. So they did what manipulative people always do. They rewrote the past. It started with whispers. I heard from old family friends, distant relatives, people I hadn't spoken to in years, suddenly reaching out with carefully worded concern. "Your parents are so worried about you. They said you cut them off completely. They don't understand why you're acting this way." It didn't take long for me to realize what was happening. They weren't just playing the victims. They were making me the monster. According to their version of events, I was the ungrateful daughter who abandoned her family the moment she found success. I had been poisoned by wealth and arrogance. I had forgotten where I came from. I had turned my back on them after they had sacrificed so much to give me a good life. It was almost impressive. The way they twisted reality with such ease, turning themselves into the noble, heartbroken parents who had done nothing but love and support their wayward daughter, who had, for no apparent reason, chosen to betray them. And then, when the rumors weren't enough, they escalated. One morning, my assistant looked hesitant as she approached me. I knew that look. The one that said, "Something just happened, and you're not going to like it." "They're here," she finally said. I didn't need to ask who. My stomach dropped, but I kept my voice steady. "Where?" "The lobby. They're asking to speak with your CFO." I should have seen this coming. Should have known they wouldn't stop at just trying to manipulate me emotionally. They were now trying to financially stake a claim in my success. I walked out of my office, down the sleek hallways of my company, my name proudly displayed on every wall, every contract, every deal. This was mine, and they thought they could just waltz in and demand a piece of it. When I got to the lobby, I saw them standing there, looking as if they belonged in the building. My father had that same unreadable expression he always wore before delivering bad news. My mother had perfected the art of appearing both wounded and morally superior at the same time. And Ben just looked uncomfortable, like he knew this was wrong but wasn't willing to take a stand. I stopped a few feet away, arms crossed. "You need to leave." My mother's lips thinned. "We just want to talk." "No," I said, voice even. "You want money." My father scoffed, shaking his head as if I were a foolish child who didn't understand the gravity of the situation. "Sienna, this is family business. You wouldn't even have this success if it weren't for us. It's time you gave back." Gave back, as if they had ever given me anything. as if they hadn't abandoned me the second I didn't fit their mold. I don't owe you anything. A flicker of anger crossed his face before he masked it again. We built you. You wouldn't be here without the Lancaster name. And there it was. The final confirmation of what I had always known, but had never heard them say outright. They didn't see me as a daughter. They saw me as an extension of their brand, a financial asset, something to be leveraged. That was the moment I realized they were never going to stop. As long as they thought there was a chance they could break me down, make me fold under pressure, they would keep pushing. So I made it official. The next day, I had my lawyer draft a cease and desist letter. It wasn't just a warning. It was a legally binding demand that they were not to contact me, not to show up at my business, and not to attempt to interfere in my life in any way. And I knew, deep in my bones, that they would ignore it. But that was fine, because I was prepared for whatever came next. And it started with a text. A simple, almost hesitant notification flashing across my screen. Can we talk? I stared at it for a long time. It was from Ben, the brother who had spent his entire life basking in our parents' approval. The one who had stood silently as they cast me aside, too afraid, or too comfortable, to challenge the system that benefited him. For years, we had barely spoken beyond strained holiday pleasantries. And now, out of nowhere, he wanted to talk? I knew what that meant. He wasn't reaching out because he missed me. He was reaching out because he needed something. I didn't respond right away. I wasn't ready to hear whatever plea he was about to make on behalf of our parents. But curiosity gnawed at me. Eventually, I replied, about what? His answer came quickly, not over text. Please, a part of me wanted to ignore him, to let him drown in whatever mess our parents had undoubtedly dragged him into. But another part, the part that still remembered the little boy who used to sneak into my room to play with my paintbrushes, the one who once looked up to me before he was molded into their golden sun, couldn't. So I agreed. When Ben walked into the cafe, he looked different, less polished, less assured. His usual confidence had been replaced by something unfamiliar, uncertainty. I watched as he hesitated near the entrance, scanning the room until his eyes landed on me. He let out a breath, then walked over. For a few moments, we sat in silence. Then, in a voice that lacked the arrogance I'd grown accustomed to, he admitted why he was there. The company was failing. The Lancaster empire, built on oil and pride, was crumbling. Years of reckless investments, market shifts, and our father's refusal to adapt had finally caught up to them. And now, our parents had turned to him, demanding that he take out personal loans to keep things afloat. At first, he had agreed. Of course he had. That was what he was trained to do. But the deeper he sank into debt, the more he realized that it was never going to be enough. They weren't asking him to help. They were expecting him to sacrifice himself completely. And when he hesitated, when he expressed the slightest doubt, they turned on him. The same way they had turned on me. I could see it in his eyes, the dawning horror of realizing that their love was conditional, that he had never been the exception, only the next in line. He was unraveling, right in front of me. And for the first time in his life, he had no idea what to do. He looked at me then, searching for something. Maybe forgiveness. Maybe guidance. Maybe an easy way out. I could have said it. The words sat heavy on my tongue, ready to spill out. I told you so, but I didn't. Instead, I leaned back, exhaled, and told him the one thing he had never heard from our parents. You don't have to keep doing this. At first, he resisted. He told me he had no choice, that this was his responsibility, that if he didn't fix it, our parents would lose everything. I asked him why that was his problem. He had no answer. I asked him what they would do for him if the roles were reversed. He already knew the answer. I could see the internal battle waging inside him. He had spent his entire life believing that loyalty meant obedience, that family meant obligation. Walking away wasn't just difficult, it felt impossible. But I had been where he was. I knew how it felt to stand at the edge, terrified of what came next. And I knew that no one could take that step for him. So, I didn't offer money. I didn't offer to fix it for him. I just told him the truth. If he kept sacrificing himself for them, he would never get out. He would always be the son who wasn't allowed to fail, the puppet whose strings they would pull tighter and tighter until there was nothing left of him. And if he wanted to change that, he had to be the one to cut the strings. Something shifted in him that day. Maybe it wasn't immediate. Maybe it took a few more sleepless nights, a few more desperate calls from our parents, a few more moments of realizing that their love had always been transactional. But when it finally clicked, when he finally saw them for who they were, he didn't just walk away. He ran, and he didn't do it quietly. The fallout was fast and vicious. Ben gathered years of financial records, documenting every manipulative demand, every time they had drained him for their own benefit. And when he released it, when the world saw the truth behind the once revered Lancaster name, there was no hiding from it. Investors pulled out. Clients distanced themselves. The house of cards that had been carefully constructed over generations collapsed. And our parents? They did exactly what I knew they would. They panicked. They called. They threatened. They begged. But Ben was done listening. We both were. The last thing my father ever said to me was that I would regret this, that I would come crawling back, that I would realize, too late, that family was the only thing that truly mattered. I think about that sometimes, and I laugh. And that's the story of Sienna Lancaster, the daughter they cast aside, the artist they belittled, and the woman who built her own empire without them. From being told she would never make it, to proving that success isn't measured by their approval, she showed that sometimes the only way to win is to walk away. As for her parents, the Lancaster empire crumbled under the weight of its own greed. The company they once boasted about was now struggling, desperately clinging to what little influence it had left. Sienna never looked back, and neither did Ben. 7 months later, life had taken an unexpected yet beautiful turn. Ben and his family had moved next door to Sienna, not just as neighbors, but as true family. There was no more rivalry, no more expectations, just warmth and understanding. And if anyone passed by their homes, they wouldn't have to ask who belonged where, because the sound of laughter that filled the air said it all. But this isn't just a story, it's real. This post was originally shared on r/TrueOffMyChest, where thousands of people reveal the raw, painful truths about family, love, and betrayal. And if there's one thing Sienna's journey teaches us, it's that not all families are built by blood. Sometimes, the ones who are supposed to love you unconditionally are the ones who will use you the most. So, what would you do in her place? Would you have walked away? Or would you have kept trying to earn a love that was never real to begin with? Let us know in the comments below. And if you want more real stories like this, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for Reddit True Vault. Because some stories don't just deserve to be told, they deserve to be heard.